For the longest time, Metroid 2: Return of Samus has been considered the black sheep of the franchise. It's easy to see why though, since most games on the Game Boy have aged pretty poorly. Regardless, Metroid 2 has found itself in the spotlight 2 years in a row now, with remakes that aim to revitalize the story and bring the adventures of SR388 to the modern era. First, in August 2016, we saw Milton Guasti, more commonly known as Dr. M64, release a fan-made project 10 years in the making called AM2R, another Metroid 2 remake, to wide acclaim and a swift cease and desist order. Almost exactly a year later, we saw the release of an officially licensed Metroid 2 remake in Metroid: Samus Returns. Together, these three games create what I'm personally calling the Metroid 2 Trilogy. I know it's not a real trilogy, but whatever. The point of this video is to take a deep dive into all three of these games and find out exactly which part each game does better and why. Why do this? Isn't comparing a fan game to an officially licensed Metroid title unfair? Wouldn't the official title win every time? I've seen this argument around and frankly, I think it's pretty silly. With as much as technology has advanced and with all the tools that game developers and hobbyists have available to them these days, it's become possible for one-man development teams to not only create games, but to create incredible games that stand next to and often exceed those that were created by much larger teams of developers. Cave Stories, Stardew Valley, Dust, and Elysian Tale, Axiom Verge, just to name a few, so no. The size of the team doesn't necessarily mean that a game is going to be of higher quality or more fun or anything like that. So fangame or not, I believe AM2R deserves a place right next to every other official Metroid title as an official part of the library, whether Nintendo wants it or not. And before we really start to dive into the comparisons, and just so I head off any expectation that I'll be completely trashing one title in favor of the other, I want to say that it is absolutely worth playing all three of these games in their entirety. And yes, that includes the original, even if it's just to understand the context of the remakes. AM2R and Samus Returns are both good games that aim to revitalize SR388 in drastically different ways. But they're also both very flawed in ways that we'll be going over in the course of the video. As for which one is my favorite? Well, I can't give everything away in the beginning now, can I? You might be wondering why this video is showing up so long after the initial hype of Samus Returns' release. Well, I wanted to do this video right. And since I'm not currently a full-time YouTuber, it's taken a long time for me to get everything done that I wanted to. I've played through Samus Returns twice, once on hard mode. I've played through AM2R 3 times, twice after Samus Returns came out, once on hard mode. I've played Metroid 2 a handful of times from childhood up until now, and most recently, a week before Samus Returns came out, and I've taken the time to read and watch other people's opinions, digest my own experiences, and hopefully give these games the attention and critical eye they truly deserve. So I hope that you enjoy this video. It's been a long time in the making. As you've probably already guessed, this video will be full of spoilers. So if you're planning to play and experience either of the remakes for yourself, I'd recommend doing so first before watching this video. And if you'd rather watch this video in parts, these timestamps will be in the description below, so if you have to come back later and lost your place, this should make it a little easier. So let's dive right into the first part of this absolute monster of a video. All three of these games are so incredibly different from one another in spite of the fact that they're all a version of the same game. They all play, feel, and look distinct from one another, and it's because of this that it's not really possible to completely count any one of them out. There's good reason though for Metroid 2 to have been remade. It really hasn't aged well. It's amazing that the developers were able to fit as much as they did on the tiny amount of memory that a Game Boy cartridge is able to hold in the first place. But those limitations are also partly to blame for many of the game's biggest flaws. Boring black backgrounds, grating ambient music, rooms getting reused in different areas, a painfully narrow viewport, and an almost complete lack of any meaningful landmarks, just to name a few. With all of these issues and plenty more nestled deep into the game's actual gameplay, Metroid 2 is not easy to just pick up and play without nostalgia or a guide to carry you through the experience. That's where the remakes come in. Metroid 1 had many similar issues with playability and questionable design choices and quirks, and Metroid Zero Mission came in and remade the game using more modern game design philosophies, tools, and more mature development experience overall, and is now widely considered one of the best Metroid games out of the whole series, completely pushing the original game into obsolescence as it was released. So if it worked for Metroid 1, why not Metroid 2? But after Zero Mission was released, Nintendo began to neglect the 2D side of the franchise and eventually the whole franchise altogether. That is, until we got Metroid Other M in 2010, a strange hybrid between the 2D and 3D games that critically bombed and sent the franchise back into darkness. Metroid was in darkness for a significant amount of time. Depending on who you ask, that period of darkness began in 2007 with the completion of the Prime Trilogy, or 2004 with the release of Zero Mission and Metroid Prime 2, given the amount of sacrifices that were made to Prime 3's gameplay in the name of accessibility and wide appeal. Either way, Metroid fans had been starved by the time August 2016 rolled around, and Milton Guasti finally released AM2R, another Metroid 2 remake, after nearly 10 years in the making. AM2R aimed to give Metroid 2 the Zero Mission treatment. What that means is updating the gameplay to more modern standards with more modern features and abilities from newer Metroid titles such as beam stacking and the speed booster, while keeping the overall world and map design almost completely the same, with a few liberties taken for artistic direction and a new area or two. I remember being shocked about seeing this game pop up in my news feeds, because I had personally never heard of it. And my initial reaction was more intrigue than excitement. I thought that it was just a fan game and therefore couldn't be very good, and boy was I wrong. The Metroid community was pretty excited to get their hands on this game. It was even released on the day of Metroid's 30th birthday, an event that even Nintendo themselves couldn't be bothered to celebrate. With Nintendo barely even acknowledging the 30th birthday of one of their core franchises, it would have been easy to assume that at that point, that they were done with Metroid. So us starving fans eagerly sunk our teeth into AM2R, which truly is Metroid 2's own Zero Mission, a modern game that remains faithful to the original. Unfortunately, AM2R was pretty quickly hit with a cease and desist order, bringing official download links down and forbidding maintenance and future patches from appearing to fix bugs in the initial release. But it didn't matter. It was already on the internet, and eager fans made sure that the game would never truly die. To this day, it's still receiving minor patches and updates from the community to fix certain aspects of the game, and it's safe to say that it'll probably be around for the foreseeable future. Fast forward 1 year later, and Samus Returns is making waves and generating excitement as the game that proves that Nintendo still does care about Metroid. Where Zero Mission and AM2R can both be comfortably classified as remakes, Samus Returns chose to set itself apart as a complete reimagining. The graphics are now fully 3D rendered on a 2D plane for that 2.5D style. New powers were added in the form of Aeon abilities. And Samus has finally gained the ability to retaliate in close range with a melee counterattack ability that helps her out in combat against the aggressive enemies of SR388. I did always think it was a little silly that Samus, with all of her strength and acrobatic ability, was completely unable to defend herself in her own games without explosives or beams. I mean, come on, she's in a totally awesome battlesuit that's made for combat. It's about time she was capable of throwing a punch. And it isn't just Samus that has changed either. The Metroid fights have become more complex and boss-like. The planet's story is more fleshed out, including the existence of the acid and the mechanism for lowering it. There are now elevators! It sounds stupid, but I was pretty shocked the first time I saw an elevator in Samus Returns. I completely expected the connecting cave systems to remain intact. The most jarring changes, however, are to how the world flows. If you take a look at the maps of each area in Metroid 2 and compare them to the maps of Samus Returns, the structure is hard to recognize. For the most part, it's all still there when you look hard enough, but when you're actually playing the game, it's very difficult to notice the similarities. Both Samus Returns and AM2R take liberties to add new areas and new bosses to the game to flesh out some of the weaker bits and to introduce their respective additions. But rest assured, we'll be digging through all that in one of the later sections of this video, so sit tight. With the stage set, I figured it'd be a good idea to start with the combat and then work my way outward to the larger and more abstract concepts. You know, gameplay first and all that. Metroid 2's combat isn't particularly interesting or quirky, it simply exists. In many ways, the flow of the combat is dictated by the extreme amount that the game's camera is zoomed in on Samus. The screen is about 7 Samus widths wide and 4 Samus heights tall. It may seem a little weird to measure the game's screen in this way, but it has a profound effect on the gameplay. The numbers make it sound like there's more space in the game than there really is, but that's mostly due to how thin Samus's sprite is. The game feels claustrophobic, and it becomes more apparent as you play through the game and compare it to its remakes. Most of Metroid 2's enemies are very simple and accommodate this zoomed-in viewport. They all tend to move slow enough that even if you're moving at your top speed, which isn't very fast, you'll have plenty of opportunity to react to something you didn't see coming. This is helped in part by the fact that because of the limitations of the Game Boy, enemies don't even act unless they're on the screen. This is easiest to see with some of the floating enemies that move in a diamond-shaped pattern. If they happen to shift themselves off your screen, they're not coming back unless you come to them. It's also very apparent with some of the Metroid fights, especially the Gammas, but there's a whole section on the Metroid fights coming up later, so I won't be spending much time on those right now. But the fact that the enemies are unable to act if they don't exist on the screen means that the zoomed-in camera is as much of an obstacle as many of the enemies and environments are. Enemies have no means to chase you down, and you'll rarely get blindsided by an enemy that you weren't aware even existed. At least unless you're quickly climbing or falling down one of the game's many vertical shafts. Even though the basis of the combat is mostly uninteresting, it manages to add just enough to the gameplay to make the exploration more engaging than it would be without it. Plus, the fact that you can find more and more powerful beam weapons as you explore feels satisfying as you're able to dispatch your foes with less shots. Even though you're given a ton of missiles, there's not much of a reason to use them in combat outside of the Metroids themselves, and you pretty much don't want to, since it can really suck to find yourself unable to finish off a Metroid due to a missile shortage. The enemies tend to die quickly enough without them anyway, so it's not really a problem. AM2R takes the basis of the combat that Metroid 2 defined and enhances it with all of the modern fixins of newer Metroid titles. Where Samus could only aim straight up, down, or to the sides in the original, AM2R allows her to aim in diagonals like in Super or Zero Mission. It's a small change, but it has a big impact on how you approach enemies. A not-so-small change is that the camera is pulled way out. You're able to see much further in AM2R than in any of the three games, which helps not just the exploration, but the combat as well. You're given about 12 Samuses by 6 Samuses of space for your viewport, totaling about 72 Samuses squared versus the original's 28 Samuses squared. That's a huge improvement, and it feels very, very comfortable. With so much space on screen, enemies are able to become a bit more complicated. For the most part, though, enemies in AM2R are just souped-up versions of the enemies that are found in Metroid 2. The same enemies, but updated along with everything else. One great example is the pancake enemies that litter the planet. They've never really been that complicated of an enemy. In Metroid 2, they just hop up when you get near and then float down gently back to where they started. In AM2R, however, they've become a bit more aggressive, choosing rather to drift towards Samus as they drift downward, baring their teeth as they attack. This really makes them feel like more of a creature than its counterpart in Metroid 2. All of the game's mechanical enemies are also great examples, as they've been improved probably more than any other enemy in the game. Not so much the little neck turrets, as I like to call them, but the mechanical hoppers and flying dumbbells and floating spike things have all been powered up considerably. They're far more durable and aggressive and really feel like the kind of machinery that the Chozo would create. The flying dumbbells even break apart after a few hits to become even more aggressive and difficult to hit. It all makes the areas with these enemies feel more challenging, and the power of these machines really fits well with the mechanical nature of the areas that they reside in. Using missiles on many of these creatures, especially the mechanical hoppers, is something that I would suggest if you want to dispatch them quickly. Aside from those mechanical creatures and the pancakes, though, none of the enemies in AM2R particularly stand out as interesting. Most of the organic creatures are just as dumb and one-dimensional as they are in the original. The frogs just hop around like idiots, the tongue bats just fly infinitely in their circles, the spiky flyers just persist in their diamond shape until the end of time. They don't feel alive. This kind of behavior would make perfect sense for those mechanical creatures that I mentioned, since they're operated by computers and simple repeatable instructions are something you would expect, but for something with a functioning brain, I don't understand the whole flying in circles forever design. I'd like to have seen them do anything else to make them more interesting. Traditionally, enemies in Metroid games have always been pretty one-dimensional and stupid, easy to predict and finish off, but even a couple of the enemies in Super Metroid were more complex and interesting than they are in AM2R, even if not by much. The key hunters, for example, just bounce off the walls, but when you approach them they swoop in towards you to attack. Or the hopper enemies that have 2 different jumping patterns that make you approach them a little differently than you would if they only ever jumped one way every time. It's not much, but it's more than what most enemies in AM2R have. The game really could have used something to make more of the enemies more interesting. But really, this is more of a nitpick since my enjoyment of the game isn't really affected by this. After all, they're just minor obstacles to your overall exploration of the world. Nitpicky as it may be, it's worth mentioning since Samus Returns manages to make enemies quite a bit more interesting and feel more alive. The creatures in Samus Returns are far more aggressive and will actively defend themselves in ways that neither of the other two games could manage. It's an addition that increases the game's feeling of being on guard in a dangerous cavern system filled with aggressive species that can and will defend themselves against potential predators and invaders. You're a large, loud, and clunky alien organism that's invading their home and disrupting their lives. And while the aggression that these enemies have is a very nice touch, I can't help but point out that the enemy variety overall is very lacking. By my count, there are about 17 different enemy types. That's while lumping together all reskins, meaning every swarming enemy is the same and every different color of these tongue bats is the same. And you might be thinking, whoa, 17? There's that many? And I wouldn't blame you, because I thought the same thing when I first counted them and saw that number. But you have to remember that includes the ceiling fish, that includes the swarm-spewing flowers, that includes the wall turrets, that includes this game's terribly weak version of the pancakes. All of these can be counted more as minor terrain obstacles that hurt you more than they can be counted as enemies. It also doesn't help that, in practice, many of the most commonly used enemies are barely different from each other. Every enemy with a shell just kind of blends together into one creature in my mind. Even the Mohiques, which are those tentacle-backed creatures that crawl on walls, feel the same as the shelled creatures, as do the tongue bats. Most of these enemies are present in every single area of the game, being recycled with a new skin color to let you know that they now deal more damage and have more health. And most of them are dealt with in the same way, waiting to counterattack them. I think that this is where the combat, at least for me, falls a little bit flat and makes the enemy variety feel a lot weaker than the numbers imply. Until you get the plasma beam, if you want to dispatch enemies with any amount of expediency in Samus Returns, you need to either wait for an opportunity to counterattack or pull off a freeze combo. This is because most of the enemies in Samus Returns have an incredible amount of health for being just run-of-the-mill cannon fodder that comes between you and your destination. So what you end up with a lot of the time is you sit still, wait for an enemy to notice you, react to the counterattack trigger, shoot, then move on with your life. With a little bit of practice, this all flows a little better than you would think, but you always need to stop if you want to get that free charge shot that comes with a successful counter. What happens when you land a successful counterattack is the enemy is knocked back into a stunned state, and your cannon fires off a charge shot without you having to charge it up yourself. For the life of me, I cannot figure out why the stun was implemented in such a careless way. If that sounds unfair to you, hear me out. There's a reason I say you need to stand still to counter. Sure, you can move and counter, but if you dare take a step or try to do anything other than fire a shot after you land a counter, that free charge shot goes away and you're stuck there awkwardly shooting way too many shots at a stunned enemy that should have died in one hit. It drives me nuts when this happens. Why couldn't the stun state just make enemies take more damage, or the successful counter do 90% of a non-boss creature's health and damage, or something that doesn't completely destroy the flow of the game? This is a huge misstep in my mind. It's clear that the developers were very proud of the counterattack feature that they made for Samus Returns, and while I think that it has potential to be a very fun mechanic and a great addition to Samus's arsenal, the clunky nature and the over-reliance on it over the course of the game made the feature get really old really fast. You'll be countering a lot, and of those few enemies that are reskinned and reused throughout the entire game, most of them have a charge attack that begs for a counter. What we have here is simply too much of a good thing, combined with a little bit of thoughtlessness in its design. Like too much pride went into this shiny new feature. What I would have liked to see is far fewer enemies that charge at you for counterattacks. Make counterattacking a fun event again by not oversaturating the game with it. Additionally, lower the health on nearly every enemy in the game. This would make counterattacks less necessary overall, and provide you with a fun option if you find yourself in close range being charged by an enemy with a shell or something. Much of this issue is mitigated by the acquisition of the plasma beam since it's so powerful and pierces through enemies and shells, and this is when the game truly starts to feel a little better since you won't have to rely on the counterattack mechanic so much. There is another method of dispatching enemies before getting the plasma beam by using the ice beam in either a missile or a melee attack to shatter the frozen foe, but that's not a style I ever chose to use, so I don't really have any footage for it. I honestly just thought it would be boring and no less tedious than fighting things the normal way. After all, so many of the enemies have shells that it wouldn't have really worked in all situations anyway. And since I spoke about the camera zoom in the other games, it's only fair to bring it up for Samus Returns as well. Believe it or not, Samus Returns actually chose to keep itself more in line with the original by having a fairly zoomed-in screen. The total Samus measurements in Samus Returns is about 11 by 4 Samuses for a total of 44 Samuses squared. The vertical height is about the same as the original, and even the horizontal is helped somewhat by my generous measurement, cutting off the barrel of her cannon, as well as the 3DS's widescreen compared to AM2R or the original's more boxy aspect ratio. Laying AM2R's viewport on top of Samus Returns, there is about 2.5 Samuses worth of space that is added towards the left and right, putting the camera's level of zoom very close to the original's after all is said and done. By itself, this really wouldn't bother me much, but it doesn't really fit in with the increased aggression of Samus Returns enemies. There are far too many instances of dropping off a ledge and falling into an enemy you couldn't see or getting charged by a tongue bat that was just above your camera's view. These kinds of situations can make it feel like taking damage isn't always in your control, and asks you to slow down a little bit more than you would probably like to. And with the way that this game's caverns tend to wind and climb, there is a lot of dropping and a lot of jumping. Enemies deal a lot of damage in Samus Returns, and when you take damage in this way, it can get really frustrating. I've spent a pretty disproportionate amount of time in this segment picking apart Samus Returns' combat and gameplay as opposed to AM2R's, which might not seem very fair, but Samus Returns manages to add so many new features that it's just easier to talk about. AM2R's gameplay is about as traditional as it comes, with most of the additions boiling down to simple quality-of-life additions like the power grip and the ability to reinitiate a spin jump in mid-air. It's taken a formula that Nintendo themselves have iterated upon over 5 different games by this point, and improved it even more. I love the idea of expanding Samus's arsenal and capabilities, and I really enjoy the idea behind a counterattack. But as I mentioned earlier, I find that it was poorly executed in a way that creates an over-reliance on the mechanic that causes it to overstay its welcome. And this poor execution permeates into much of the moment-to-moment gameplay of exploring SR388. Especially since Samus Returns is so densely packed with bullet-spongy enemies with very short respawn timers. It's because of these reasons and one other that I personally feel like the combat in AM2R outshines that of Samus Returns. The simplicity really goes a long way here. That one other reason is Samus Returns' free aim technology. But I'm going to speak more about that in the next segment of this video, since this segment is already long enough, and many of my issues with the free aim technology are much more easily explained in the context of Metroid 2's main goal, fighting Metroids. Samus's main goal on SR388 is the eradication of the Metroid species. It's not a terrible idea, all things considered. After all, with what we know of the species, they're very invasive and destructive to a planet's ecosystem, and are difficult to dispatch without special technology. With this goal, you can expect that you'll be fighting Metroids a whole lot. But Metroid 2 wasn't content on giving you 40 plus of those jellyfish-like creatures to fight through and then call it a day. No, what Metroid 2 did was establish the idea that the iconic jellyfish form of the Metroids we know and fear are simply the larval form of the species. The implication of this paints a picture of a species that is far more powerful and dangerous than initially thought. And remember, the initial thought was that this species is dangerous and needs to be eradicated. Good thing Samus is on the job. You know, I think it would have been a much more powerful moment if this fact wasn't revealed within the first few moments of the game, and Samus's first enemies were instead some larval Metroids. Sure, Samus would have to start with her trusty ice beam since that's the only way to destroy these creatures, but I think that's an acceptable thing to do and expect. I mean, whose idea was it to send Samus down to the Metroid's home planet without the single weapon that is known to destroy the only form that they even know about? I'm starting to have doubts about Samus's aptitude as a bounty hunter. Anyway, fighting Metroids takes a significant portion of the game, and defeating a set number of them per area is your goal that will unlock further areas of the game, so it makes sense to give them their own section. I'll be covering each one on its own here in probably too much detail, and also expounding on my issues with the free aim technology of Samus Returns, since those issues are most apparent during these fights. Each of these games gives you the same types of Metroids in the same order. They all start with the Alpha. In Metroid 2, they're incredibly simple beasts. They play a little game of stop and go as you fight them. They'll inch towards you one step at a time until you sink enough missiles into their soft belly to kill them. AM2R's version of these little guys upgrades them a little with a slightly larger brain and some actual combat capability. They'll rarely stop to catch their breath and will swoop around trying to hit you with their sharp beaks. The most interesting thing that AM2R does with these Alpha Metroids, though, is make them smarter and deadlier as you get further in the game, as if they've gained experience in combat and learned how to fight as they master their new form. They'll start actively dodging your missiles as you shoot, and they'll start using a new attack where they back up and then charge at you at high speed. Their movement patterns also change up slightly, and overall, they're more difficult to defeat. They can get kind of annoying in their later form, however, since having them dodge your missiles so often can feel kind of cheap and unavoidable, especially since their weak point is so well protected and difficult to hit compared to the Game Boy version of them. There's even a couple of rooms where you fight multiple alphas at once in AM2R, and it even further elevates their difficulty in a neat way that's not replicated in either of the other two games. But by far the best part of the alphas in AM2R is that you can actually see what stage of growth they're in just by looking at their sprite. The older ones have these comically dangly little legs that just run in place like a little dog you lift out of the water while it's swimming, and it's pretty funny. But it also expands on the Metroid physiology in a very interesting and appreciable way. In Samus Returns, the Alpha takes on a completely different moveset and method of attacking. They consist of 3 attacks: pooping out little electricity balls during its floating phase that you can shoot for pickups, a swooping charge attack that you can counter for a chance to unload missiles into it, and an electrified swooping charge attack that makes the creature invulnerable, which it likes to do in groups of 3. The best way to stop this last one is just to trick it into ramming its head into a wall, which will send it back into its floating phase so you can continue attacking it. There's a second form of alphas though, a more evolved version with red electricity, a mossy-looking carapace, and a stronger version of the electricity poop attack. This stronger attack has the Alpha Metroid drop a large blob of red electricity on the ground, which will briefly cover the ground in a zone of damage. One of the more interesting aspects of these Alpha fights, however, is the fact that you're able to use the ice beam shots to damage them, which gives you a way to win if you run out of missiles, and the ability to use charged ice beam shots to slow them down and force them into a counterable charge. I'll admit I didn't really bother with this aspect in either of my playthroughs because I wasn't really aware of it. As gamers, we're all probably pretty used to bosses and enemies with somewhat contrived mechanics and weak points for the sake of gameplay, but most of the time they still actually feel like enemies. They'll still be menacing and aggressive and whatnot, but in Samus Returns, Alpha Metroids never felt like an actual creature to me. They felt more like a weird minigame. This comes down to the 360-degree aiming mechanics of Samus Returns. In previous 2D Metroid titles, you're limited to your 4 cardinal aiming directions and any combination of those for 8 different angles. While somewhat limiting on its own, it can make fights feel more dynamic by requiring more movement and jumping to line up your perfect shot. This extra jumping also adds in an extra layer of difficulty and decision-making by forcing you to ask the question, is it safe for me to jump right now? Will I fall into something that I can't avoid if I jump at this very moment? This is a key element of a lot of enemies, and especially bosses in games with heavy platforming elements like the Metroid series, and it wasn't until playing Samus Returns that I was really able to realize just how much the lack of free aim really adds to the feeling of these games. These Alpha Metroids don't feel like enemies or bosses except in the moments where they're actively charging at Samus, which is a very small percentage of the time spent during these fights. The rest of the time feels just like target practice, as the Metroid slowly floats high above you with its weak point completely exposed, showing absolutely no signs of aggression. These aren't the attack patterns of a highly predatory and very dangerous creature that was created to kill. This is the behavior of a bow and arrow minigame in a Zelda title. My theory is that these Metroids were designed in this way because of the free aim mechanic in Samus Returns. Sure, this feature gives you the ability to freely aim without having to precisely position yourself to line up shots, but while you're aiming, it takes away your mobility almost completely. Because of this lack of mobility, the developers were forced to design the Alpha Metroids in such a way that using free aim wouldn't be dangerous, and most of the fights suffer greatly for it. And the whole thing is exacerbated by the fact that the free aim completely replaces the ability to aim diagonally with freedom. Yeah, you can aim diagonally, but you need to hold up and forward on the analog stick, which, of course, sends you running forward with all of the grace and momentum of a charging rhino, which makes it almost completely useless for most fights in the game. Let me be clear here, I'm not saying that removing free aim would make these fights better. In fact, these fights would be decidedly worse without the free aim, since the alphas are designed so heavily around the floating target practice style of movement that they seem so keen on doing in the middle of a fight. No, if anything changes, it'll have to be an almost complete redesign. Even though I'm not really a fan of the frequency that alphas and AM2R dodge missiles, I believe that AM2R does fights against alphas the best out of all three of these titles, and that's mostly due to the way they evolve both visually and tactically. They're just so much more interesting in AM2R. The second type of Metroid you'll be fighting is the Gamma Metroid. In Metroid 2, they're not hugely different from the alphas, as they'll still move towards you aggressively and try their best to get right on top of you. They have more health and a new attack where they'll spit lightning in an arc in front of you. While most of the alphas in Metroid 2 are fought in larger and more open rooms, giving you an ability to move and jump around to avoid damage, most of the Gammas are fought in awkward spaces. At the bottom of a hole, in the middle of a sand pit, a two-layered room with a small ceiling and a high-up alcove where the wrong move can send you flying out of the room. These spaces are what tend to make these things more difficult than they actually are. But they can get pretty difficult if you're not careful, as their tendency to want to give you a big hug will drain your health quicker than you would expect. You might be tempted to fight them at a distance, but like I mentioned earlier, enemies off-screen don't really act or exist until you bring them back on-screen. So it's up to you to make sure that your new hug buddy is within seeing distance. Because of the way AM2R does its best to remain loyal to the source material, you'll be fighting its version of Gammas in the same awkward spots as in the original. AM2R gives you more space to move around and see in general though, so that helps fight these things. Because of the tight hitbox on the Gamma's weak point though, you'll probably miss a lot of shots as you try to deal more damage than you take during these fights, especially in some of the more difficult to maneuver areas. Overall, AM2R's version of the Gamma isn't much different than Metroid 2's. The only real notable difference is that it has the ability to grab and electrocute you if you're not careful, but past that, they're nearly identical. Samus Returns makes the Gamma Metroids a lot more complex than either of the other two games. I gotta give them credit here, Gammas absolutely feel like an evolved version of the Alpha Metroids, for all the good and bad that this entails. Just like the Alpha Metroids, they retain their silly little target practice behavior of floating back and forth in the arena, high above Samus, while completely exposing their weak point for you to exploit. However, the Gamma has quite a few more tricks than the Alpha. In addition to dropping electricity that covers the ground and attempting to ram into Samus, it shows an even greater mastery over electricity. It can blast an electric nova and shoot a bolt of lightning towards your direction. It doesn't spend its entire life in the air though, because these guys have legs and, yeah, they're gonna use them. Occasionally they'll drop down to the ground and start walking around like an insect. The Gamma's ground phase is just as silly and gamey as the target practice air phase of both it and the Alpha before it. It still has its lightning attacks here on the ground too, so it will occasionally use its nova, or lightning blast, or cover the surface it's standing on with electricity, so it gives you a lot more to be afraid of on the ground. It also gives you a reason to want it on the ground because its final attack is a bite. And this is what you're going to want to try to counterattack, so you can pry open its beak and force feed it half a dozen missiles. The Gamma Metroid in Samus Returns feels a lot more menacing and a lot more creature-like than the Alphas did, but they still feel very artificial because of their target practice mode and their tendency to barrel forward while they're on the ground. Heck, most of the time when you're trying to bait out their bite so you can counter for massive damage, they'll just barrel through you as if you weren't even there. It feels less like they're trying to attack you most of the time, and more like they're just attacking in your general direction like you're invisible, hoping to hit you. All that said, I do think that Samus Returns does this type of Metroid the best out of the three, but that's with a pretty big caveat. The Gamma Metroid absolutely overstays its welcome in Samus Returns. Not only is it the main Metroid type for one of the absolute longest areas of the game, which is Area 3 and is just arbitrarily large for no real reason and takes forever to work through, but there are a few sections where this Metroid type is used to pad the game's length in a very, very annoying move by the developers. If you played Samus Returns, you probably know what I'm talking about. Some of the Gammas will run away from you once you deal enough damage to them, forcing you to leave the room, find the next arena where they decided to pop up, and fight them again. Often they'll run from this arena too and force you into a third. If this mechanic was used in place of killing a few more Metroids for the total number that you need to defeat to move on, then this might have been better received by me, and it wouldn't have hurt them to spread this kind of thing out over the game rather than put almost all of them in the same area. But neither of these things happened, and it just makes the Gammas feel really annoying, and by the time I finished fighting Gammas during my first run-through with the game, I was absolutely sick of them. The dumbest thing about this is that there is very often little discernible difference between each room that you fight all the Gammas in. And that just further contributes to the gross gamey feel that they have as you're fighting them. But even with that, I like fighting them much better than AM2R's hug-hungry floaters. Though I would still prefer it to be less gamey and more of a real fight, if you know what I mean. The Zeta is where we stop being Metroid and start ripping off Ridley Scott. In Metroid 2, they form some meaty legs, grow a large and very recognizable head, a spindly tail, and have little grabby arms that do nothing. They still float though, which is kinda weird. But we can chalk that up to the Game Boy not being very strong and the developers not having a lot to work with. They're still very similar to the previous Metroid types, but this time, they know how to respect your personal space and will float above you and attack by spitting. As usual, just fill them full of missiles and you'll eventually take them out. While AM2R's recreation of the Alpha and Gamma Metroids were pretty faithful to the original, the Zeta is where this remake decides to start changing things up. AM2R takes a look at the legs and says, "Hey, why doesn't this thing use its legs?" So AM2R makes it use its legs. This version of the Zeta has 4 real attacks: an aggressive jump, an energy projectile, a poison spit, and a rarely used charge. It's not a very complicated fight, but don't let its simplicity lull you into a false sense of security, because these things are incredibly annoying to fight. First, their weak point is incredibly well protected and difficult to hit with consistency. Second, they really like deflecting missiles. I most recently played AM2R on hard mode in the original 1.0 version, then again on normal mode in the updated 1.31 version, so I don't know if it's because of hard mode or because there was a nerf to the Zetas, but the missile deflection they do was very obnoxious in my former playthrough. They were much more manageable in my latter playthrough, but even without the obnoxious amount of missile deflection, I don't care for this fight at all. In addition to the missile deflection and the difficult-to-hit weak point, another big reason I dislike this fight is because of the way the Zeta moves around the arena. Most of the arenas are the same. They're either flat or they have a small dip or rise in the middle so the creature can jump a little bit. The difficult hitbox makes the non-flat arenas pretty annoying, and that's on top of the Zeta's frustrating tendency to rudely shove you into a wall all the time. It just moves in your direction, sometimes slashing, until it hits a wall, jumps back in surprise, and sprays the corner full of acid spit before turning around, walking far into the other direction, finally to just turn back around and repeat. You can try your best to hit it with as many missiles as you can before you're shoved into a wall and forced to avoid it, but it's going to take a lot of cycles, especially if you miss most of your super missiles. You could try jumping over the Zeta, but in my experience it often turned out to be a pretty bad idea, as there's only a very small area above it and it's a bit of a tight fit. Plus, there's no weak point on its back, so you're gonna have to wait for it to turn around anyway. And if you jump too late, like when the Zeta is about to hit the wall, it's going to jump back into you and hurt you anyway. Overall, I really dislike AM2R's Zeta Metroids. They don't feel particularly good or fun to fight, and I found them more frustrating than anything. But at least they're menacing, right? On the other hand, the Zeta Metroids in Samus Returns are far more interesting even if they're a little bit less menacing. Like the Zetas from AM2R, Samus Returns grounds these guys, but makes them a little more lean and climby. It spews fire breath, spits fire acid in bursts of 3, and moves and jumps with more agility than any of the other stages. It has a bite attack that you can counterattack for a missile barrage, and once it goes to the ceiling, it likes to fire 6 bouncy acid spits and then makes itself grappleable. At this point, you can pull it down off the ceiling for some free shots to its stomach. Sometimes it won't even fire the bouncy acid spit and instead decides to give you a very easy time pulling it off of the ceiling. Even better, once you have the phase drift, You can activate it after you pull the Zeta off the ceiling, and time is slowed just enough for you to destroy the Zeta in the span of one pull down. These Zetas suffer from the same gamey feeling as the previous evolutions do in Samus Returns. While they're more aggressive and fire shots directly at Samus, the whole thing with being able to grapple the Zeta down for some free shots just strikes me as extremely out of place and drags down the whole fight. I think this fight is reasonably well designed as it is, but I don't think it's a good fight. I realize that might sound a little bit like an oxymoron, but while everything here works as a piece of the gameplay, none of it is really believable, if that makes sense. It's like watching a bad actor in a well-written role. You like the story and the lines coming out of that actor's mouth, but you don't believe a single word they say. The Zetas of Samus Returns aren't frustrating or tedious in the same way that they are in AM2R, but the weird way that they climb on the wall and turn into a weird turret just to eventually spew some weird bouncy stuff all over the arena and open themselves up arbitrarily to a grapple move that destroys them really drags the whole experience down. Samus Returns wins the Zeta category for me, but I still dislike the fight. Unfortunately, neither fight is very good, but at least you don't fight very many of them throughout the game. After the Zeta comes the Omega, and in Metroid 2, they're actually pretty difficult to tell apart. The Omegas are a little bit bigger than the Zetas, but they still float, and now they're missing a part of their tail. They still like to keep their distance and shoot balls of stuff at you, but this time they'll actually swoop in at you and really throw you off your game as you scramble to get in a good position to unload more missiles. It's really difficult to not take damage in this fight because the motion of the Omega Metroid is really odd. When they're not swooping at you, they'll just stay in the air shooting fireballs at you, but what makes it weird is if you scroll the screen, the Omega will scroll with it. These take a lot of missiles to kill and a lot of time, but good use of the screw attack will protect you from taking too much damage here. AM2R continues the ground-locked theme of evolution of the Zeta Metroid and makes them a little bigger, a little more dangerous, and a little more annoying. They're much more armored, but they have an extra weak point on their back when they do their jump and lunge attacks. By the way, that jump attack is pretty rough. If you're touching the ground when it lands, the immense force created by the Omega landing will hurt Samus and knock her down, so you need to stay pretty mobile for this fight. In addition to those, the Omega has replaced the acid breath with a full-on fire breath that covers so much area that you might have a hard time aiming your missiles as it opens up its belly for damage. If you get too close, it can swipe at you. Other than the Omega's fire, pretty much every time you get hit in this fight, Samus will be knocked down, which really helps sell the size and power of these highly evolved Metroids. Even though these guys have been nerfed since the game's initial release, they're still a bit of an annoying fight. One of the safest strategies both in this fight and the Zeta fight is to curl up into a ball at the edge of a room and wait for the creature to turn around and walk in the other direction so you can start shooting it once it turns its back towards you. This is because there's often very little room to jump over these creatures to give yourself some breathing room, and many of their attacks will close off that space even further, making you risk significant contact damage for even trying. So the default strategy for me, and for many other players, especially the first time through the game, is to curl up in an entryway. The big problem with this, though, is that with the right stroke of bad luck, one of the creature's attacks can hit you through the wall and knock you back into the previous room, forcing you to start the fight over again from the beginning. And if you are doing well, that really sucks. Interestingly, I found this fight a little easier than the Zeta, mostly because the Omega feels like it's a little more deliberate with its attacks. Plus, if you manage to get behind it and it uses one of its jump attacks, the little weak point on its back, though harder to hit, deals a lot more damage. So if you manage to land a super missile or two on that spot, the fight is much easier. It is difficult to hit though, but the risk of wasting ammo is often worth it. Overall, the Omega is much more of a fair and fun fight than its little brother, but I still don't think it's a very good fight. Like its little brother, the creature's tendency to crowd you into a corner with little room to escape just gets annoying and feels cheap if you choose the wrong time to jump over it. I feel like this could have been easily circumvented by designing a way to morph ball through the creature's legs while it's breathing fire or something, because then at least you'd have some options and more things to think about as you fight. And while we're on the subject of rolling through the legs of an Omega, guess which game allows you to do exactly that? The Omega Metroids in Samus Returns have a lot going on with them, and in my opinion, they're some of the best fights in the entire game. They'll alternate between a swipe with their spindly little arms and a swipe with their meaty tail, or 2 swipes in Phase 2. They'll shoot laser breath either at you or in a horizontal line, making you float above it for a few seconds. In Phase 2, the laser breath changes to go either from low to high or high to low. And this is where it's actually useful to roll under its legs. It'll try to lunge at you with a bite, which is when you're going to want to counterattack for a lot of damage. And finally, it can make an earthquake with its tail, causing rocks to fall from the ceiling, which is beefed up in the second phase as the Omega combines that with the floor is lava laser. These fights tend to be relatively long, but they're pretty engaging the whole way through. And the fact that the Omega has a little cage formed around its weak point means that you have an extra layer to fight through, and once it's gone, you have a limited amount of time to do damage before the Omega regenerates it. It's a pretty generous window though, so it doesn't ever feel like you're really that pressed for time. Plus, once you have the power bombs, which you end up finding after the first Omega fight, a single one of these is all it takes to destroy the cage around its weak point. The second phase isn't much different from the first, but it makes the creature feel desperate as it slightly changes up its combos and attacks to be a little more dangerous. I have 2 big complaints about this fight though. The first is the rockfall attack in the first phase. This is just a dumb attack and there's nothing threatening about it. The Omega doesn't care to attack you while the rocks are falling, and you're able to destroy them with your normal cannon fire with ease. Add to that the fact that a rock will always spawn directly above you no matter where you are, and you end up learning that the best strategy for this attack is to just stand still, aim up, and spam your shot until it's over. You'll even get a lot of health and ammo refills just for destroying these rocks, which makes the fight even easier. And that leads to the second complaint that I have, and that's that the Omega's just too easy. Other than the Alpha and perhaps the Zeta if you're using that cheesy phase drift trick, there isn't really much that's threatening or difficult about the Omega, especially once you learn its moveset. On top of feeling relatively unthreatening, the fact that you can net so many refill drops from destroying rocks in the Quake phase and destroying his chest protection cage, which you're required to do anyway, means that it's entirely possible to leave these fights with more health than you started with, and that any mistake you make can be remedied pretty easily and quickly. But even though they're easy fights, they are a lot of fun every time, and I'm actually disappointed that there aren't more, because they are by far the best Metroid fights in Samus Returns, and the best Omega fight among all 3 of the games. The Larva Metroid is the Larva Metroid in all 3 games. What did you expect? Freeze, shoot, win. Easy. The Queen. Your ultimate goal on your path to the Xenocide of the Metroid species. She's enormous, powerful, and protective, and she gives it her all to defend her nest. She's relatively simple in the original with only 2 different attacks, one being a face lunge with her mouth either opened or closed, and the other is some weird projectiles that she shoots from her mouth. All you gotta do is time your jumps correctly to avoid the lunges, and screw attack through these projectiles and you'll be fine. And while you're doing that, unload some missiles into her face. If you land a missile while her mouth is open, she'll freeze and give you an opportunity to roll into her belly, where you can then place some bombs for massive damage. After a while, she'll die. She's pretty tough though, with how much she lunges and how little room you have to jump, and she does a lot of damage. So if you take too many hits, you will probably die pretty quick. If things get too hairy though, her boss arena is built in with an escape hatch so you can refill and try again without dying. AM2R takes this fight and pushes it straight into overdrive. When you first drop in, she looks and operates almost exactly like she does in the original Game Boy version of the game, with some slight differences. The first difference is that her head will track you as you move, so you'll need to juke her attacks if you want to be safe. The second difference is that the projectiles that she shoots need to be shot down themselves, but they'll provide you with some missiles and health refills for your trouble. Third, there's no emergency exit. Sink enough missiles into her and she'll get desperate enough to charge up a massive fireball that destroys the wall behind you. This is awesome! What AM2R does with this fight, even though it's not particularly complex or difficult, makes the final confrontation feel epic. It really feels like she's pushing you back with the intensity of her presence and power as the two of you desperately struggle to survive against each other. She even changes her attacks up slightly as you move through the ruins of some old Chozo structures, and even adds an acid spray further in. Eventually, she pushes you back through the other side of the ruins into a dead-ended cave with little room to move. She gets her jaws around you, and then this happens. Everything about this is just amazing, and the way you finish her off is nothing short of epic. Sure, the fight is a little easy with the Queen's simple attacks and the fact that her projectiles drop so many refills, but the overall experience of the fight is an amazing way to cap off such a dangerous and powerful species and actually make it feel threatening. The whole game builds up so well to this final confrontation, and it doesn't disappoint. Samus Returns, on the other hand, I'm not too crazy about this version of the Queen. It's interesting, because while it seemed like the gamey nature of each Metroid fight up until this point was reduced with each evolution, the Queen brings it all back with perhaps some of the most because video game attacks of the entire game. Her bite attack and her head slam are the only attacks that, in my opinion, even make sense in the context of the fight with the way they function. Once you do enough damage, she has a second bite attack that you can counter for a stun, which you can then follow up with either a few more missiles or a trip into her belly to deliver a power bomb as a trade for some damage on yourself. The rest of her attacks are where the Queen, as a boss fight, breaks down in both believability and fairness. The first is her fire laser, which coats any surface it touches in a harmful layer of flames. Not a terrible attack in concept, but the fact that it's never aimed directly at you and moves so slowly gives you a significant window of time to force-feed the Queen a bunch of missiles as she patiently paints the walls. She does this very often, since many of her combos revolve around it. The first combo involves pairing it with some acid spit, similar to the acid spit from the original game and AM2R, in concept at least. Instead of being projectiles that fly at you, forcing you to either dodge or destroy them, these float in the air all around the room, forcing you into an awkward pachinko situation that makes it incredibly difficult to move around the room. If this was all you had to deal with, it wouldn't be that difficult of a situation. But the Queen usually likes to combine this with her fire laser. When you first encounter the floating acid spit, you might think it's a good idea to stick to the ceiling with the spider ball, since it makes you really small and you're just mobile enough to avoid the slow-moving death balls. But sometimes, in addition to her coating the back wall with flames, she'll decide it's a great idea to coat the ceiling. So now if you find yourself on the ceiling and she decides to paint it, it's up to you to find a safe place to drop between all of the green crap. And it's not an easy drop. There's a lot of these green things and they move around, so they're hard to avoid if you have to make any vertical motion. You'll probably end up taking most of your damage from trying to avoid these things altogether. The other combo that she enjoys doing that involves painting the wall in flames is to paint the back wall and then use her lung power to blow you into it. Your best bet here is to activate your spider ball to stick to the ground and move towards her to keep your distance from the wall. Under normal circumstances, this isn't difficult to deal with, but later on in the fight she'll combine all three of these things: the acid blobs, the fire paint, and the wind. In my opinion, this attack is unreasonably difficult to avoid. Not only does the nature of the floating blobs make it incredibly difficult to jump or reposition without getting hurt, but the addition of a wind blowing you into the back means that unless you're in the right spot to begin with, you're almost guaranteed to take damage when these three attacks get combined. And the acid blobs don't even stay still, they slowly move around their location until they run out of time, and they last quite a while. Another bit of unfairness that the Queen likes to do with her acid blobs is to coat the back wall, then coat the floor while you're still on it. Because of the green blobs, you can't use your space jump to avoid the lasers, and because of the flames on the back wall, you can't even spider ball your way to safety. No, there's only one move that can keep you safe in this scenario, and it's the one optional secret ability that the game never explains: the Bomb Spark, also known as the Spider Spark. I don't have any footage of this particular ground-to-ceiling movement, because I never thought to do it when I got caught in this situation. But that's because I never once expected it to ever be the only solution for any boss fight in this game. Optional abilities that aren't explained, like the wall jump and shine spark, might be required for 100% completion at times, but never in a Metroid game have they been a requirement for defeating a boss. So it never, ever even crossed my mind. What makes this supremely unfair is just how much damage the Queen actually does with every single one of her attacks. She hits incredibly hard, even on normal, and with the way her combinations work with her acid blobs, you're left with a fight that ends up feeling very unfair for a significant portion of the fight, because you'll spend a lot of time avoiding these lasers and trying to dodge these blobs. It wasn't until my second playthrough, which I did on hard mode, that I learned about the absolute best way to deal with this green blob garbage that the Queen is so keen on using and using and using. The best way to simplify this fight is, once you recognize that she's going to blob all over you, position yourself on the back wall with the spider ball, and then spider spark into her face when she starts her laser. If you do it right, you'll fly right into her face, which will stop the laser attack and make all of the green blobs just vanish. This particular spider spark seems to be a little finicky at times, but I've found that if you at least wait until she starts her laser breath and actually hit her in the face with it, it works every time. This tactic on its own makes the whole fight so much easier and so much less unfair, because you'll never have to deal with the green blobs ever again. This just screams awful design to me. If a move is hidden and is never explained like this spider spark is, it should never, ever be required for a boss fight. And the fact that it's absolutely required with one, admittedly rare combo, and completely nullifies another in such a big way, makes me wonder what was going through the minds of the developers with this fight. I will say that the Queen in Samus Returns isn't entirely unfun, because it is enjoyable to a point, especially once you understand the utility of the spider spark as it relates to this fight. But it never should have been so powerful for this fight, and the acid blob combos that practically force you into taking a lot of damage are by far the most unfair thing that exists in this game by a long shot. And it's not just unfair, it's also just not very interesting. These are not attacks from the Queen as much as they are hazards that you must avoid during a fight. It's all just so because video game that it completely pulls me out of the fight every time, with what should be a very climactic moment of the whole game. I spent a completely unbalanced amount of time ragging on the Samus Returns version of the Queen here, but that's just because of how needlessly complex and unfair a lot of her attacks are compared to the simplicity of the attacks of the AM2R version. Even though it's easier, the Queen fight in AM2R is, by far, the better fight when it comes to the Queen. Metroid 2 is a pretty unique game, even for today. With the exception of the Queen herself, the game features no bosses other than the few dozen Metroids you'll be fighting over the course of the game. Unless you want to count Arachnus, of course. In Metroid 2, Arachnus is more of an annoying mini-boss, but that's the closest you'll get to a threatening enemy that's not a Metroid. He's still neat though, as you'll find him posing as an item ball on a Chozo statue like the cheeky little jerk he is, which is a nice surprise for first-time players. And for your trouble, you get the spring ball. But past that, there are no bosses to talk about in the original game, and even Arachnus on his own isn't worth much discussion. However, AM2R and Samus Returns both decided to spice the game up with a more threatening Arachnus and a small host of other new bosses throughout their version of SR388. I won't be going into quite as much detail for each of these as I did for the Metroids, but we'll be touching on each one. As I mentioned, Arachnus shows up in both remakes, and they both borrow heavily from the moveset of the Arachnus X boss that shows up in Metroid Fusion. Arachnus is pretty neat in Samus Returns, and you can really feel the weight behind its attacks and bounces. He hits pretty hard, but if you just keep on sinking missiles into him, he'll die pretty quick. It's a solid fight, if a bit simplistic, but fun nonetheless. In AM2R, the fight is a lot of fun, but suffers from much of the same because video game weirdness as many of the Metroid fights do in Samus Returns. It's a strange little change-up that I didn't even realize until writing this script. I mean, look at it. Bouncy, perfectly horizontal projectiles, perfectly spaced flame pillars, a weird Sonic-style spin attack from the air, and spikes on the ceiling that you have to use bombs to blast Arachnus into. That last part is especially weird, because how do these tiny little bombs send something so large and heavy so high into the air? It's very gamey and pretty stupid if you think about it too hard, but overall it's actually a really fun boss fight. And that's all the bosses that both remakes have in common. So I'll hit up AM2R's bosses first, then finish up with Samus Returns. The Ancient Guardian shows up on your way out of the first area once you clear it. It's a great surprise, since you walked through the corridor previously to enter the area in the first place, and this thing just pops up to ruin your day. It slowly closes the walls in on you, providing you with a sense of tension as you proceed through the fight, even if it's linked to the boss's health. It's got a bunch of different attacks that are color-coded, and each one follows a specific pattern that asks you to do something specific in return to avoid taking damage. It's a well-done fight, and when I first encountered it, it was a wonderful surprise that told me there are bosses in this game. This one is just a little weird. You grab the space jump from the hands of a Chozo statue, only for it to reveal itself as a Torizo. Alright, cool, paying homage to the bomb Torizo from Super Metroid, I can dig it. But as you damage it more, it starts to get faster and faster, to the point where, in my opinion, it gets to be really unfair. Until you finally do enough damage to it and it takes flight? The ceiling falls away, the floor fills with spikes, and now you're engaged in aerial combat with a statue that spits out flying bugs. Aside from the unfair speed on the first phase, the Torizo on its own was really cool, but this flying section is just awkward. It's fun enough once you get the hang of its pattern, sure, but it just feels terribly out of place compared to everything else in the game. Almost like it's one of those, you know what would be cool kinds of bosses. Let's look at the tester. And no, I'm not talking about that terrible show that Egoraptor was briefly a part of.
I just figured this kind of challenge would really turn some people off.
The tester is a machine built by the Chozo that's meant for literally testing their weapons. This thing fires variants of your own weapons at you, like the plasma beam, wave beam, missiles, and more. It's some nice attention to detail and a neat idea, but overall it's not a very good fight. You fight this thing in a tall vertical shaft, and the tester likes to hang out at the top. The only footholds you have on the top half of the room are these awkward collapsing platforms that only give you a second or two of offense before you're thrown off. This forces you to keep moving as you scramble to simultaneously chip away at its shields, avoid its projectiles, and find a new platform to stand on. Destroying any of the hard shields or any of the guns it generates during the fight will net you a hefty pile of refill pickups, which will be the main thing keeping you alive during this fight, because you will be taking a lot of damage. This is basically a bullet hell boss, and this many bullets with the gravity of a platformer are not a great combination. Plus, its ice beam attack is absolutely horrible and nearly impossible to avoid. Look at the way this thing splits! What are you even supposed to do about this? There isn't much to say about this boss. He shows up during an escape sequence and, truthfully, isn't much of a boss and isn't very difficult. He's really just here to increase the feeling of tension as you race against the timer to escape, and it does a wonderful job of it as you scramble to hit its weak points as hard and as fast as you possibly can. It's a very unexpected boss in the best way, and is a very fun addition to the experience of the escape sequence. Ceres is a boss and a creature that's lifted right out of Metroid Fusion, since Fusion takes place aboard a vessel that's researching the organisms of SR-388. It's a cool fight, if annoying at times. Ceres swims frantically around the room, destroying blocks in its way as you blast it with missiles. First, you gotta weaken it by freezing its segments, then blasting those with missiles, and from there you just blast away with more missiles until it dies. While the fight itself is pretty cool, I'm not a huge fan of the way it plays out. It can get really annoying constantly getting your platforms knocked out from under you, especially after dealing with the same thing so recently with the tester. But if that was the worst of its problems, it'd be fine. The biggest problem with Ceres is that, similar to the first form of the Torizo, it speeds up to frankly ludicrous speeds. I'm fine with bosses getting harder as you fight them, but this is not the way to do it. Genesis is more of a mini-boss, but an interesting fight nonetheless. You can find it skulking around the Federation ship on the surface in an area that's unique to AM2R. The whole area builds up to this fight, and when you finally find it, it's taken down with just a small handful of super missiles. It's a very agile creature with a few interesting attacks that hints to a lot of potential for this creature that simply wasn't realized. Supposedly, this boss was programmed in just a few hours a week or so before the game came out, so it makes sense why it's so simple and underwhelming in spite of the build-up, but I would have liked to see a lot more done with this guy. Whew, that covers all the bosses in AM2R. I could have gone into more detail with each one, but this video is going to be long enough without that. Overall, I'd say AM2R's bosses are mostly alright, with some missteps here and there. There's a good combination of fun and world building in these encounters, and they help break up the monotony of Metroid after Metroid after Metroid decently well and in a very welcome way. Now, on to the bosses of Samus Returns. Not counting Arachnus, Diggernaut is the only non-Metroid boss in Samus Returns, which is in stark contrast to the variety of bosses that appear in AM2R. This boss has a little bit of an arc in this game, not unlike your favorite side character in a JRPG. You first wake it up in Area 3, and once you do, the giant machine will look you over, then wander off. In Area 4, it realizes just how much of a jerk it is and proceeds to trap you into a chase sequence that spans 3 long corridors. And this chase sequence is tight. And I don't mean tight like the colloquialism for cool from 2 decades ago, I mean tight as in there's not much room for error in this sequence. If you take a wrong step and fail to react to it quickly enough, or you stumble on your way through and get stuck, or if you simply aren't sure exactly of which path to take, the Diggernaut's gigantic drill will crush you into a rock and grind you up into a nice fresh bounty hunter burger. It's an instant kill too, so if you're caught, you're dead. It's not exactly fair. In fact, I'd definitely say that this chase sequence is very, very unfair. You're asked to go through a labyrinth with little room to make mistakes, with enemies getting in your way and blocks to bomb and shoot with missiles that you might not recognize soon enough. It's probably gonna kill you. Many times. Luckily though, there's a checkpoint at the beginning of each corridor, so dying isn't a big deal. In fact, because of these checkpoints, this sequence can be as unfair as it wants, and so it's fair. Except no, it's not. Checkpoints don't make a design like this okay in my eyes. It's a frustrating section, and I found that it wasn't any less frustrating on my second run-through when I knew what to expect. I appreciate the fact that being crushed and the impending death is supposed to impart a sense of urgency and dread as a giant drill threatens to pound you into a pulp, but the checkpoints completely undermine any of that. The only fear I had was the annoyance of having to start the corridor over again because the developers couldn't be bothered to design something that's more fair or skill-based than this trial and error section that's basically designed to just kill you. I don't like it. At all. But at least you get the space jump for your troubles. The Diggernaut's final appearances are in Area 6, where for some reason it steals a power-up from you as you approach a Chozo statue, only for you to take it back by force a little bit later. This is one doozy of a boss fight, and I think it's a lot of fun. As you fight it, you need to dodge drills moving in weird patterns, brace yourself against the vacuum while forcing it to suck up bombs, avoid patterned lasers, and destroy falling blobs of acid. It's a very engaging fight with very readable patterns that you'll quickly and easily learn how to react to, and overall it's quite a lot of fun. I have a few major problems with it though. First, the way you damage the drills is just kinda dumb. I mean, it's neat that the developers were able to incorporate a minor spider ball puzzle into the boss, but this is just not very good. When you incapacitate this boss during the first phase, it will drop down and rest on its drills. These drills will then spin in a kind of slot machine style motion, and it's up to you to wait for, first, the conveniently placed smooth surface to align so you can climb it, and then for the conveniently placed empty shaft for you to drop into and bomb a weak point. Never mind the effects that this would have on the efficiency of the drills and how the drills would likely be pulverized by rock that got clogged in these shafts, we have a game to make! We can't worry about this! Even worse, if you miss your opportunity the first time, you're stuck waiting and waiting for everything to conveniently align again so you can try one more time. And this never happened to me, but I'm almost certain that if you miss it a second time, the Diggernaut will recover and you'll have to do the whole first phase again. Okay, but why don't you just jump onto the track halfway through? Surely that's faster than waiting? Yeah, I thought of that. But unfortunately, there's a 2-inch thick piece of steel that's covering a minor amount of the drill on the exact plane that you happen to exist on. It's hard to see, and I jumped into it a couple of times before I realized it was there. And it does contact damage for no discernible reason. And when you finally get to the top, you then have to wait for the shaft to align before you climb all the way to the bottom. But here's the dumb thing. Look at this nice smooth surface at the top of the bottom layer of the drill. Surely it's no different than the nice smooth surface that you're currently resting on as you wait for your moment. Nope. No, that hurts too. Needless to say, I hate this little segment. Next problem, there's an attack phase that the Diggernaut goes through where it will turn into a vacuum and suck up everything in front of it. Now, up until this point in the game, there has been exactly one type of thing that has anything to do with air moving things, and it's the little air vents that suck in your bombs at key points throughout the map, and more on those later. My first instinct against this attack was simply to avoid it. But once you enter the third phase, the Diggernaut doesn't voluntarily stick his head out for you anymore for you to pepper him with missiles. What you're supposed to do is feed bombs into this vacuum, just like the little air vents throughout the game. If you remember those and make the connection, you're good. But if you don't, you're going to be jumping around like an idiot all day, because that's the only thing that will incapacitate the boss now. Eventually, I decided to just try it and it worked, but many people didn't make the connection or attempt bombs much longer than I did, because it's far from obvious, which I can only imagine made the fight extra frustrating for those players. Even better, in a mechanic that's never been explored until this very fight, you're able to spider ball cling to the floor to prevent being sucked up and getting hurt, allowing you to feed the boss many more bombs during this attack. And my final big problem with this boss is its head in the final phase. After you feed it enough bombs, it will be incapacitated. But instead of hitting it with missiles, you need to hit 3 key points on its head with a combination of the spider ball and bombs. This would be perfectly fine, but this requires that the little blue lines are aligned before the bomb will do any damage. As you would expect, this gets more difficult as you damage more of the nodes. The first is easy, the second isn't much trouble, but the third is a nightmare. In addition to waiting for these to align, the Diggernaut's head will also electrify periodically, preventing you from being able to attach to it. Having the head rotating along with the electricity knocking you off means that you might miss your opportunity to lay a bomb for the final hit. And if you do miss that opportunity, you'll almost certainly be forced into another phase, having to repeat everything just for the chance to try again. The Diggernaut is the very definition of a mixed bag. As much fun as I found this encounter, it's full of design missteps, from the player not knowing what's required of him to move on, to mechanics that force a lot of waiting. But this fight is capped off with one of the most fan-servicey little cinematics I've seen in a long time, where Samus finishes off the Diggernaut with a single blast without even looking at it. And I love it. After this ordeal, you get the power bombs, which are a very welcome addition to Samus's arsenal in this game, even though it might have taken a little too long to get to it. But I must confess, I lied to you when I said that this was the only non-Metroid boss in the game, because there's one more. Metroid 2 ends at the Queen. At least, the meat of the gameplay does. What follows is basically an epilogue where Samus decides to spare the last Metroid, as the two of them, in silence, make their way back to the surface of the planet to board Samus's ship and leave. AM2R mostly keeps to this air of quiet contemplation and reflection. No enemies, just an uneventful and silent departure that puts a period on the atmosphere that Metroid 2 creates throughout the game. There's a lot more to say about atmosphere, but Mark Brown's Game Maker's Toolkit video about Metroid 2 analyzes this far better than I could, so I highly recommend giving that a watch. There will be a link in the description below so you can watch it later if you haven't yet. Anyway, this is the boss section and not the atmosphere section, so what gives? Trust me, this is important to set the mood for my feeling about this upcoming boss. So you kill the Queen, meet the baby Metroid, and make your way to the surface. Except this time, there are enemies. The journey is no longer quiet and contemplative. It's just as dangerous and murdery as the rest of the adventure, which is in stark contrast to both Metroid 2 and AM2R. There's even a final save point, and then once you approach the cliff overlooking your ship, a cinematic begins where none other than Ridley himself swoops in and snatches the baby, leaving you to fight him. As a fight, I think Ridley is the best one in the game. He's a lot of fun to fight and is by far the most dynamic fight, as you jump over swipes and fire bullets and anything Ridley tries to throw at you, and you fight him primarily with your beam weapon. Super missiles hurt him, but regular missiles just bounce off, so most of your time is going to be spent peppering him with plasma. Which is pretty neat, because it allows you to go ham without having to be too careful about your ammo count. And it's actually sort of liberating. My only real problem with this fight is that he takes too much time to kill. Ridley's got a massive health pool and you're gonna need a lot of shots to take him down. He overstays his welcome just a little bit, and once I finally beat Ridley for the first time, my hands really hurt. You're constantly pressing nearly every single button on the 3DS throughout the whole fight because of how much movement it involves. And with needing more than one attempt to take him out, my hands were pretty cramped by the time he was finished. In spite of how much fun Ridley is in this game, I absolutely detest the fact that he's in the game at all. It completely undermines the quiet, contemplative aspect of the end of the original game, which left you with nothing but silence as you walk back to your ship and think about how you've eradicated a whole species. It pulls focus away from the entire reason you came to SR388 in the first place, and puts Ridley front and center rather than the queen of a highly destructive and parasitic species. Ridley and the space pirates were never involved in this mission and never needed to be. As far as I'm concerned, it's lazy fan service to hype up Metroid fans, and as well done as the fight itself is, Ridley doesn't belong here. It even calls into question the timeline of events between the end of Metroid 2 and the beginning of Super Metroid, because if Samus just trashed Ridley and left him on SR388 heavily injured, how does he manage to get to the space station where Samus drops off the Metroid so quickly? Not only does he get there fast, he breaks in pretty easily, steals the baby Metroid, and causes the entire facility to self-destruct. I just don't buy that Ridley was able to recover that much in that short of a time span. At least he's fun to fight. I'm not going to go into immense detail about the exploration aspect of each game's worlds, but there is a lot that I want to talk about with some specific things that really stood out to me. The world of Metroid 2 was never very well defined, mostly due to the hardware, but does go out of its way to establish a Chozo history there. This is not just the home planet for the Metroids, it was of some special significance to the Chozo race. What that exactly is, well, it's hard to tell. Each area has a slightly different aesthetic, but as for each area's purpose, well, that's best left up to the imagination. Both AM2R and Samus Returns flesh out the seeds of ideas that Metroid 2 left about what went on this planet. Mining facilities, distribution centers, science labs, ancient temples. There's a lot to take in both of the remakes, each with their own supply of detailed tile sets, extravagant backgrounds, and area-specific gimmicks that help paint a picture of what the purpose of each area was. They also both add a whole lot to each area, with AM2R specifically adding a completely new area that didn't exist in the original. But they both do this in different ways. AM2R does its best to faithfully recreate each area with some liberties taken for side paths, connecting tunnels, and small extra areas. For the most part, everything from Metroid 2 remains as it was, which is really interesting to see if you've played both AM2R and the original. On the other hand, Samus Returns feels more like it takes a loose inspiration from the original world design and adds a lot of space. And I mean a lot. Samus Returns takes each area and expands it greatly, such that each area becomes pretty massive. I'll have a few animations going on in the background that were made by Reddit user RQAA3721. If you're watching this, thank you so much for making these, they're awesome. I'll also have a link to an album with all of these in the description, so check them out if you want more time to look at them. These maps by themselves tell a lot about how each area is constructed and what parts of each game bear similarities to each other. Before I saw these maps, I was completely convinced that Samus Returns didn't follow the original map's structure at all. But it's pretty much all there, just blown way out of proportion with an increase in scale and many, many more extra rooms. More isn't always better though, because I really don't like the way Samus Returns lays out its worlds. There's almost never a direct path through any room. It's mostly twisting, winding, crumbling, or otherwise blocked off with some missile blocks or bomb blocks that are placed in slightly awkward locations, and it all makes backtracking through the game feel like an absolute chore. And during your first trek through the game, once you acquire the grapple beam, the game will throw dozens of these red grapple blocks in your path that have no real reason to exist other than to impede your progress in an incredibly contrived way. Contrivance is just the name of the game here. The map design feels haphazard and unfocused because of all of this, and like it really didn't go through the required amount of iterations to make it feel all good and organic. I mean, if you have to put some strange air vents at some critical location that can be bombed just so the player doesn't reach an area too early, then I think you've screwed up. Those air vents are especially egregious to me as they serve no other purpose in the game except to stop you from going where the developers don't want you to go. You could argue, I guess, that they're there to teach you that the bombs can be sucked up by wind for the Diggernaut fight much later in the game, But this is a poor teacher. There are many better ways to teach the player such a critical piece of information, and based on how many people got stuck on that phase of the fight, it doesn't work anyway. Compare that to AM2R's design, where wandering through places feels like you're actually traversing rooms that feel like they're logically put together as a part of something. That's the big difference here. There's nothing really interesting about Samus Returns rooms in any area. They all feel so independent from what the background says they're supposed to be that it feels like you could just slap any old pretty background on any area of the game and nothing would feel any different. And it's hard to talk about Samus Returns world design without bringing up one of the most contentious additions to the game, the Scan Pulse. This power lets you trade a minuscule amount of Aeon to reveal everything on the map in a large square around you. Item and room locations are revealed, and as long as you make sure to reveal any edges of the map, it's easy and effortless to find everything. I'm not really a fan of it. This ability by itself removes any excitement from actually exploring the world, because you already know where the dead ends probably are and where the path forward probably is. It reveals breakable blocks all around you, so it's practically impossible to get stuck anywhere or be confused about where to go. Now, Metroid has always had a bit of a conveyance issue when it comes to its secrets, and sometimes when it comes to its main paths. You probably know what I'm talking about, those moments where you're desperately looking for the way forward or a secret that you haven't found yet, only to find it's hidden behind a completely unmarked and otherwise unremarkable wall that you have to hit with a bomb to reveal whatever it is you're looking for. Video Game Donkey has coined this as a Metroid moment, and I have to agree with him. This type of thing is poor design, no matter how much I love this franchise. I bring this up because this is exactly how a large chunk of the world in Samus Returns is designed. People are always quick to shoot down others who dislike the Scan Pulse, calling it optional, but I completely disagree with that assessment of this power-up. While it's true that you can get through the entire game without using it once, I fundamentally disagree with the notion that one of the main abilities that you get in any game should be considered optional outside of challenge runs. And the way the map is designed and the way you're supposed to travel through the various corridors and shafts in Samus Returns is by finding obscurely placed breakable tiles that are, you guessed it, unmarked and otherwise unremarkable. And this is prevalent throughout the entire game. So to play through Samus Returns without this ability would be like voluntarily subjecting yourself to a game full of these Metroid moments. Another counter that I tend to hear about the Scan Pulse is people comparing it with Super Metroid's map rooms and X-Ray Visor, saying that they also reveal everything. But here's the thing. First off, map rooms in Super Metroid don't reveal everything. They reveal a lot of the main structure of an area, but still leave a significant chunk of it for you to find and explore on your own. As for the X-Ray Visor, yeah, sure. It reveals everything, but only in a narrow angle of the room you're currently in. You have to make the choice to sacrifice your time and momentum to activate the X-Ray Visor to confirm whether or not that suspicious-looking wall actually has something more behind it, and it's pretty inconvenient and clunky to use. Those are the big differences, a combination of player choice and agency from the X-Ray Visor, and leaving plenty for you to explore and discover on your own from the map rooms. That's the magic of these games to me, exploration and discovery. It feels good to go out of your way to a place that you suspect might have a secret hidden, but it feels less good to know ahead of time that there absolutely and definitely is a secret there. Now you just gotta go get it. To me, the Scan Pulse feels more like it's either a band-aid for bad and confusing level design, or a crutch that allowed the level designers to not have to think so critically about what they were doing. Given how much I've harped on Samus Returns level design, you've probably already figured out that I much prefer AM2R's level design as a whole. Larger rooms and more direct paths might sound boring to you, but having to traverse through gimmicks every single time I want to go through a room gets annoying fast, especially when it's time to backtrack. Backtracking wasn't a thing in Metroid 2, but it's become a staple of the franchise and the whole subgenre that it has helped spawn, so both AM2R and Samus Returns implement this feature in their own way. They both supply you with a number of upgrades that you can collect during your initial visit to each area, but they both decide to lock a number of them behind locks that you'll need to remember to return to after you've collected the appropriate key. But only if you want to. So in that regard, the backtracking is very much optional, and isn't required to beat the game. But with a game that's as linear as Metroid 2, how do you incentivize backtracking, and how do you make it so that it's convenient and doesn't force you to literally walk all the way back? Well, here's how Samus Returns does it. As you travel through the Samus Returns version of SR388, and especially the first 5 areas, you will be blocked off from many paths by various tiles that you don't have the ability to destroy yet, and, in the case of most areas, you won't be able to fully clear them out until you've beaten the Queen and acquire the baby Metroid. That's right, what was originally an epilogue with a quiet moment of contemplation for you after beating the ultimate boss becomes a noisy prequel to the real final boss and a jolly romp all the way back through the planet to collect power-ups that are locked behind baby gates. To the game's credit, there aren't many power-ups that require the baby, and a lot of the baby gates are just alternate routes that short-circuit whatever puzzle is blocking your access to that power-up. But there are enough of them where if you value efficiency, you'll soon realize that if you don't want to waste time, then your best bet is to never return to a previous area until you've collected all the power-ups in the game. And it shouldn't be understated just how much is locked in places you can't reach yet on your first time through an area. I tend to be pretty vigilant in these games, and I tried to collect everything I possibly could before moving on to the next area, and that was made pretty simple by the scan pulse. But I stopped doing that somewhere in Area 4 when I realized that about half of the collectibles in each area will be completely inaccessible to me at the time that I encounter them. At that point, I got fed up and stopped going as out of my way as I was before to collect these things, so I started missing more. I still got most of them though, and without backtracking at all, my final item count when I beat the game was a very low 60%. If I had to guess, I'd say that the maximum completion percentage that you can get without backtracking is about 65%, which is still incredibly low. About 50% of the items in areas 1 through 5 are unobtainable during your first pass. That's a lot. That's entirely too much. A few would be okay, but 50% is beyond excessive. Especially considering that none of these have any meaningful exploration, puzzle solving, or execution involved. A vast majority of them are just go to the lock, use the correct key, collect your reward. It's busy work and that's it. And the most sinister thing about all of this are those baby gates that I mentioned. Let's say that you know how Metroid 2 plays out before you dive into Samus Returns. You know that the Queen is the final boss, and you know that the game's been pretty hard up to the point where you fight her. Or maybe you don't know Metroid 2 well, but you're still expecting the Queen to be pretty tough and you aren't very good at the game. So, perhaps you want to complete your item collection before you beat the game. That's a natural response, right? Perfectly normal. But if you didn't remember the baby gates, you'd end up visiting every area and collecting almost everything there, leaving behind the few power-ups you need the baby for. So you beat the Queen with something like 98% and then get the baby, just to have to go out of your way to return to those few areas that you couldn't complete without the baby so you can finish off your collection. That sucks, and I feel sorry for anyone who fell into that trap. It's a dirty trick. And what sucks even more is that there are so many of these power-ups scattered throughout the world that they needed to reduce the amount of ammo that they give you so you wouldn't be too overstocked by the time you got them all. Because of that, and how uninspired most of the puzzles are, makes them feel so much less rewarding than they have in any other game in the franchise. Missiles only increase by 3, and super missiles and power bombs only increase by 1.
Please, consider the following.
Samus Returns has 80 missile expansions, 30 super missile expansions, and 14 power bomb expansions. If we were to raise the amount of ammo you get for each, you could end up with 48 missile expansions, anywhere from 6 to 15 super missile expansions, depending on whether you raise each to 5 or 2 or anywhere in between, and about 7 power bomb expansions. You'd end up cutting the total number of ammo expansions almost in half, but each collectible would feel more meaningful and rewarding. Each puzzle leading up to an expansion could have more time spent on it, and less map space would be wasted by all of the boring and unengaging half puzzles that currently plague Samus Returns. That could also potentially mean that more time is spent iterating and refining the world they have to make it, suck less. It might sound like I'm petitioning for less content in the game, and I kind of am. As it is right now, Samus Returns feels like it's the product of someone in a suit saying that the game isn't long enough and that the fans will be upset if it doesn't reach X number of hours. But while some of these hours are pretty fun and a solid experience, there are plenty of wasted hours on this frustrating backtracking, the excessively high number of expansions, the stupid fleeing Gamma Metroids that you have to fight 3 times, and the very high damage that every little enemy in the game inflicts on you, causing you so many deaths. And all that is in addition to this point that I made in my original review of Samus Returns. And especially the animation time when you do anything that has anything to do with one of the game's many pressure plate systems. I wish I was exaggerating, but I timed it. Saving the game takes a full 12 seconds. Stand on the plate, wait for it to descend, walk to the save station, let it scan you, walk away from the save station, regain control. Taking an elevator is about 18 seconds. Using the game's teleporters and refill stations are probably comparable to these. It doesn't sound like a lot, but these are things that add up very quickly because you do them so often throughout the course of the game. I'd actually be afraid to go through all my footage and count up exactly how much time I wasted on all these tiny little animations. So yes, while I am asking for less content, I'm also asking for more quality content. I took around a total of 10 hours for my first 100% completion run of the game, and this is quite a bit faster than average based on what I've read, but not every single one of those 10 hours was what I would consider quality. Time wasted by those previous things I mentioned detract from the overall quality of the game, and in turn, make it much less replayable for those who like to replay their games. I'd have been much happier if the game was 4 to 6 hours, and all of those things that I mentioned were resolved, because the whole game would feel much better and much more tightly designed as a result. As it is now, the game just feels like it's absolutely filled with artificial padding. That was a long time spent harping on Samus Returns backtracking and item collection, and I haven't even talked about AM2Rs. Where Samus Returns backtracking feels forced and expected with the inclusion of teleporters that give you some nice control over choosing where to go, AM2R somehow manages to make the whole experience more organic and not nearly as in your face. My most recent playthrough of AM2R ended with 81% for a leisurely explore everything run with no backtracking, and while that wasn't completely blind, it was at least a year removed from the last time I played the game. I still missed plenty of items, and while some would require backtracking, most don't. The numbers alone, 81% versus 60%, tell you a lot about how each game wants you to backtrack. Samus Returns practically begs you to, but makes it feel clunky and forced. But what AM2R does is trick you into backtracking on accident, in a completely organic way. It still surprises me a little bit to think about how well done this is in AM2R. The Distribution Center is a new area that was added to AM2R and is a fully realized zone with its own little gimmicks and stories that are pretty fun. I do find the zone a bit frustrating and confusing to navigate, and is probably my least favorite zone to explore in the game, but it houses something really important. The Distribution Center is effectively the internet of SR388.
And again, the internet is not something that you just dump something on. It's not a big truck. It's a series of tubes.
There's a specific room that has a handful of these tubes that you eventually find, and this is after going through a few of them elsewhere to reach various locations in the same area. So once you do find this room, you don't think it's anything really that special until you enter one of the tubes and find yourself back in one of the early areas of the game, with one of your newer abilities allowing you to bust out of the previously inaccessible room. And then you think one of two things. Well, since I'm here, I might as well finish exploring this area with my new powers, or why am I in Area 1? I'm going back. Either choice works just fine, and it also serves as a neat discovery and a reward for your overall progress in the game, rather than just feeling like a slapped-on feature that was added in because it's a Metroid game and needs backtracking and they needed a way for it to be less annoying. However, I do have a problem with that fast travel room in AM2R, and it's that one of the tubes in that room actually takes you to a new small area that gives you the gravity suit, which is required to progress. This can be confusing for the player, because if they're anything like me during my most recent playthrough, they'll write the room off as the fast travel room, leave, and then get confused when they can't find their way forward. This tube really should have been in a different room. Aside from that minor blemish, the organic feeling to backtracking that this little room and its connections represent is an impressive and inspired design that works great and ties the world together remarkably well. And because the puzzles and expansions are more impactful and the feeling of actual discovery is not ripped away from you by the scan pulse like it is in Samus Returns, it's actually a joy to go back and explore, especially when combined with the much more zoomed out viewport that I talked about way at the beginning of the video. And all of that was without even going into how it feels to move around the world. Because of that zoomed-in viewport, a simplified wall jump that isn't enjoyable or even complicated to pull off, an almost complete lack of any abilities that modify your speed, the hyper-aggressive enemies that do way too much damage, and the overcomplicated labyrinthine paths of practically the whole game, the act of exploring in Samus Returns tends to feel slow and sloppy, as if you're constantly impeded by something. Trying to move quickly is often punished by a swift slap to the face from one of the many enemies on nearly every screen of the game, and because of the sheer size and scale of each area, it gets old by the time you're halfway through the game. AM2R, on the other hand, feels very fluid and snappy, and the size of the viewport alone makes traversing through rooms with enemies involve much less guesswork and trepidation. You have all the information you need to move safely, and doing so is simply down to your own skill as a player. And with the inclusion of things like the classic wall jump, the speed booster, and the shine spark, there are many opportunities to speed up your movement through the world, and a high enough skill ceiling that you can continue improving at the movement alone through the whole game. There's so much more depth in AM2R's movement, and I believe that a deep, responsive movement system can carry a game pretty far on its own. After all, the one thing you'll be doing in just about any game more than fighting enemies is moving from point A to point B. Make that as fun as possible, with plenty of interesting things to discover along the way that don't tease you too much with locks that you don't have keys for yet, and you have a recipe for success. There's one more thing that I want to go over very briefly with these three games, and it's a little bit of how the story unfolds. I won't spend a long time on this, I promise, but I think it's worth mentioning some of the huge differences in storytelling that all three of these games employ. Metroid 2, like most of the games of its time, was pretty minimalist, where the story was simply a vessel to drive the design. It exists as little more than a central thesis to the activities that you'll be taking part in over the course of the game, and it doesn't even exist in the game except through the gameplay. Everything that you needed to know was in the little instruction booklet that shipped with the game's box. You know, back when those were a thing. Samus Returns opens with a nice little prologue that, for the most part, actually matches what was in the original instruction booklet. It's been refined for the current state of Metroid lore, but it's all there. Once you're in the game, however, there's very little to go off of. The only story beats that you'll get in Samus Returns are taken from the environmental backgrounds, and even then there's not much. The most impactful thing that you'll find is that, rather than arbitrarily lowering when you've defeated enough Metroids, you plug in the defeated Metroid's DNA into a gigantic lock that, once you've inserted enough, will lower, or at least in one case raise, the acid. And keep in mind here, when I say acid, I know it might not actually be acid. It's a strange, hazardous purple liquid that the Chozo presumably created that fills the connecting tunnels of the cave system under the planet to keep the Metroids in and the invaders out. Of course, it didn't work, and some Metroids got out anyway, so good job, you stupid birds. You blew it. I do like that Samus Returns actually takes the time to explain, even if only in subtext, how this stuff actually lowers. It's always bothered me in the other two games how once you kill enough Metroids, the acid just so happens to magically lower itself. I've heard theories about how it's actually caused by the Queen Metroid being telepathically linked to all of her brood like a hive mind, and the pain of losing her kin causes her to throw a tantrum that shifts tectonic plates which drains the acid, but if you think about that for more than a second, it feels less plausible than magic. Why does it just so happen to occur so conveniently every time you've killed every Metroid in an area? How is it that every time it does happen, it conveniently reveals the next area? It just doesn't add up. There's just way too many coincidences, and I appreciate the way Samus Returns puts a little bit of reason behind it. There is still some contrivance to how these DNA-powered padlocks all know exactly how many Metroids lie within a given area, as if the Chozo themselves left somebody behind to count the number of Metroids that are around and program it into the machine before leaving the planet, hoping that none of the Metroids happen to die of some natural death that they didn't anticipate. But at least it's still better than magic. Within the game, that's pretty much all you'll get in terms of the story. If you 100% the game, though, you'll unlock a little selection of wordless pictures that tells a story of its own. A prequel story of sorts that illustrates the events that happened before the Chozo left the planet, which includes the discovery of the X-Parasite, the creation of the Metroids to combat the parasite, the metamorphosis of the Metroids into something the Chozo could no longer control, the sealing of the planet, and finally, some sort of betrayal between different Chozo factions. This final slide with the betrayal is the most interesting part to me, because it sheds a new light on the Chozo race whom I'd believed, perhaps naively, were completely benevolent. AM2R, on the other hand, has a much shorter prologue section, but also includes a scanning feature so you can learn more about the planet, its inhabitants, and learn some of the main story that appeared in the original instruction booklet. This feature is completely automatic and optional and has absolutely no effect on the gameplay other than maybe helping you learn the weakness of some of the various bosses. It also lets players learn more about every area and enemy in the game, and for the first and only time in this whole video and in any comparison of these three games, this is where it matters that AM2R is a fan game. Because of that, unfortunately, anything in this story or lore or logbooks, unless corroborated by another piece of canon somewhere in the franchise, cannot be taken seriously as perhaps canon, which is really too bad considering how much work went into this stuff. Still, it's very much appreciated that it exists at all. But more importantly than the logbook are three special moments, two of which you'll find in a secret area in AM2R that you can only reach once you get the power bombs and then backtrack. The first and largest is finding the landing site of both the research team and the follow-up combat team on a new area of the surface. You can explore the research vessel and end up fighting the mini-boss Genesis, which is a nice little atmospheric experience within the game. In this same area is the second moment, and it's small. It's the little frog cave from the beginning of Metroid Fusion where Samus gets infected with the X. The final moment is something you'll run into naturally, and it's the existence of the Federation teams that came down to this planet and came from those ships. You'll find the remnants of the research team in one area, and in another area you'll find what's left of the combat team getting ripped apart by an Omega. How they even got down to the levels of the planet that they were in without the acid destroying them is a good question for sure, but the fact that AM2R acknowledges them at all is an incredible little detail that really stands out in the overall level design and world building of this title. AM2R's attention to the story simply blows Samus Returns out of the water with the way it builds SR388 with not just Metroid 2 as an inspiration, but also Metroid Fusion. Remember, the research station that you explore in Metroid Fusion is something of a recreation of the biology on SR388, so these remakes have plenty of material to pull from, and AM2R was not at all shy about taking what they could from Fusion and putting it into AM2R. And it makes the planet feel that much more alive as a result, and makes this fan game feel very much like it really is canon and an official Metroid game. And this extends all the way to the very ending of the games. AM2R stays true to the atmosphere and the finality of the xenocide that it just forced upon you, leaving you with introspection as your reward as you make your way back up to the surface. It even stays true to the scarcity of the enemies you'll encounter as you get closer to the more powerful and developed Metroids and their queen, creating a sense of scarcity of life in the midst of these incredibly destructive creatures in their own lair. And you can see the profound impact that the Metroids have had on this planet and its environment, and why they're so dangerous and must be eradicated. Samus Returns, though, just throws all that out completely. Enemies are plentiful and feel even more dense as you approach the Queen, with the iconic huge empty room just before the Queen and her larva being turned into a final maze filled with enemies and collectibles instead of a quiet climb to your destination. And once you defeat the Queen, there's dozens of enemies left to defeat as you venture back to the surface, loud as ever, to eventually face Ridley. With all that and the fact that the baby is the final power-up that you need to collect the rest of the items in the game, all sense of finality in the mission is stripped away from these final moments of the game and is replaced by fan service. Even though it's a fan game, AM2R's world and story feel more definitively like Metroid 2 than Samus Returns does. Samus Returns, by comparison, feels like it pays no respect to much of the established past of the franchise, while AM2R happily draws from it as much as possible. Once again, I'd like to urge you all to watch Mark Brown's video on Metroid 2 and its remakes, because it elaborates on what I cover here and talks about even more. I think I spent a lot more time in this video criticizing Samus Returns compared to AM2R, and because of that, I want to reiterate what I said at the beginning of this video. I think Samus Returns is a fine game, and I had quite a bit of fun with it in my 2 playthroughs, and I would recommend any fan of Metroid to pick it up and play it for themselves, even after I tore it apart. But for me, it's never going to be more than just fine. Samus Returns and Mercury Steam went out of their way to innovate the franchise, and while I think they did a much better job than Team Ninja did with Other M, it still misses the mark of what makes a Metroid game. Exploration and discovery is at the core of this franchise and the subgenre it helped create, and at some point in development, it seems like that was forgotten. Of course, that's not to say that action cannot be an equal partner in this equation, because it very well can be. Look at titles like Dust and Elysian Tale, and Guacamelee for some good action-oriented Metroidvanias that don't sacrifice the feeling of exploration and discovery. But even for those titles, the action never pushes exploration to the background in the way Samus Returns does. And for that reason, Samus Returns never quite had that magic for me. It's just too bogged down by a few glaring design issues, an overall lack of care and refinement, and feeling like it's been artificially padded all over the place. With all that in mind, AM2R gets my vote as the definitive Metroid 2 experience. I could not care less that it's a fan game, because it was made with a professional touch with almost all of the detail and polish that Nintendo themselves are famous for when it comes to their first-party games. It deserves a place next to all of the officially created titles as a part of the Metroid franchise. And no, I don't mean instead of Samus Returns, because it deserves its place too. Again, I would recommend playing all three of these games somewhat close to each other for the best experience. It's truly great to see how this one game was reimagined in two completely different but still viable and fun ways, and you're bound to love one or the other. And before you go into the comments and tell me that I forgot this or I forgot that, I know I didn't go over every single thing about these games. I had to stop somewhere, right? For example, I didn't talk about the difference in the way bombs work in these games and how gross bomb jumping feels in Samus Returns, nor did I talk about how I think AM2R's soundtrack is lazily filled with nostalgia bait for most of the soundtrack, in spite of how awesome the soundtrack is overall. Not that Samus Returns did much better with this, but it at least takes some of the soundtracks of the original and fully realizes them, including the weird ambient tracks. There's so much more that I didn't cover, but I'm content with how this video ended up. But hey, that's gonna do it for this video. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching this monster of a video. This is by far my longest video I've ever made, and it's been haunting me ever since its inception. I vastly underestimated the amount of effort and stress required for a project of this size, so don't expect me to do videos like this very often. I can only hope that if you're hearing this now that you enjoyed the video and gained something from it, even if just a couple of hours of entertainment. I want to take a moment and shout out all of my patrons, especially Mig, Aeldis, and Leifel. It's because of you and all of my patrons and everyone who watches this channel on a regular basis and left positive comments that I felt comfortable taking such a huge risk on a huge project like this. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you. And if this is the first video you've seen from me, like I said, this size of video won't be regular, but I do hope that you'll stick around and enjoy some of my other content and hit that subscribe button for more content sort of like this in the future. And be sure to follow me on Twitter at ingeniousclown if that's your thing, and I will see you next time.